essentially in competition in ways that were not anticipated or not normal for that particular event. Is that okay? Are we all going to fall asleep? Yes. Okay. So as I mentioned today, we're going to talk about competition and wrap it up. What are the outcomes of inter-species competition when you have more than one species? We'll talk about invasive species. These are lionfish pictured off the coast of Florida, and the Caribbean Ocean is not the normal ecosystem for lionfish, and they have become incredibly invasive, probably released accidentally or else intentionally out of the pet trade, and they are voracious predators of all kinds of different types of fish, and they're toxic and camouflage well, and nothing in the Caribbean coral reef ecosystem likes to eat them, and so they have had a population boom. They have had exponential population growth without a predator in order to control their population numbers. And so now they'll pay scuba and snorkeling divers in order to spearfish and collect and kill these invasive lionfish. It's not uncommon to see large schools of them where there are 40 or 50 of these guys. If you get spined by them, you'll get a really nasty wound that develops in even human kind of tissue. And so they're problematic not only for the ecosystem, but also for ecotourism. And they're a good example of a competitive invasive species that we have here in the U.S. Okay. All right. As I mentioned, we are going to talk about the 3 consequences of inter-species competition, what's possible when we have 2 or more species that are competing with each other. And these outcomes can be one of 3 things. And we highlighted on Tuesday that there's some math that predicts the outcome of interspecies competition based upon the growth rate and the carrying capacities of the different species that are involved. And it depends what the starting population size is, what the growth rate, what the carrying capacity size is of the different types of organisms as to what you get at the end. But in 3 of the 4 kind of math scenarios we looked at, extinction of one of the species happens. Okay, and that's competitive exclusion, which we had introduced at the end of class on Tuesday. We're going to talk about coexistence today, which is what we see most often in the environment, and that's going to involve niche differentiation and resource partitioning. As I mentioned, then we'll tie this into our discussion of evolution and natural selection that we talked about at the beginning of the term, and then we'll spend some time talking about invasive species. And again, a ton of this interspecies competition work was done in salt marshes, very similar to this one off the Chesapeake Bay. A lot of this work was also done on intertidal rocky shorelines, where it's easy to manipulate the types of species that are present. So you can mow down, remove one species, and then see if the other species can grow there. You can exclude certain species and see how that affects growth rate and survival and reproduction. They're very easily manipulable environments that have a set gradient already built in terms of salinity and moisture, exposure to sunlight, different kinds of temperature extremes during the day. And so they make really nice ecosystems to do this type of competition, and then we're going to see also predation systems. All right, so we have these 3 possible outcomes of 2 species interacting with each other. And in general, this type of competition is negative for both. Like, it ends up depressing overall growth rate and fecundity and population size for both species. But very often, one species wins, okay? It drives the other species to extinction. So one of the possible outcomes of competing with another species is that you go extinct, okay? You get competitively excluded from that particular ecosystem. You don't get to live there. The other guy was a better consumer. What we tend to see, though, is that organisms differentiate their niches. They begin to specialize in certain aspects. Their interactions with other organisms, in addition to the fundamental variations that occur over space in all of these environmental factors, lead to little pockets where individual species can be the best competitor, but then they're not in the little pocket over. A mile away, conditions are different, and a mile away, another species exists. And that's niche differentiation. That's sharing the possible niche space through realized niches. The idea that you don't exist always in your whole space where you might exist as a species. You have some portion of that where you're the best competitor. And that means that we can have two species that might be direct competitors with each other for a particular resource that actually can coexist because they live in different niche spaces. And then a subset of that we're going to learn today is resource partitioning, which is where organisms that actually do live in the exact same geographical space and have very similar competitive resource needs begin to be specialized. They become the thick-billed Galapagos finches versus the little small-billed Galapagos finches. They live in the same place, they utilize the same resource, and they start to specialize so they're no longer in direct competition. That's resource partitioning. It's taking a resource and chopping it up into little bits that each species gets a piece of the pie. You don't get the whole pie anymore, but at least you get some. You don't go extinct. You can coexist with other species. And that type of resource partitioning is what's happening with these different chipmunk species in the picture here. They all exist on this mountain slope, but they have started to specialize in different habitat species for both feeding and nest building. And those species of those different tree species then and shrubs live in different elevations. And thus it restricts them to a portion of the whole resource space. They are specializing. We've had niche differentiation. They now live in different geographic spots. City.
I think we already answered the question. Like, I thought they changed their diet, so like when they specialize.
Yes, and that happens very frequently. And that you as a species may decide that you're going to eat only green beetles, and your competing species decides it's only going to eat brown beetles. Now, you didn't talk to each other and come to this peace accord, unfortunately. But because some of you started to just eat brown, then you had to leg up because you weren't in direct competition for the greens. And the other species saw there weren't a lot of brown beetles because you were eating them, and they started eating greens preferentially. And then you specialized, and you're no longer in direct competition. And you both get to live. If I walk in front of the thing, I get these furry like shadows that form super cool. All right, so just another reminder about competitive exclusion and what this looks like. Competitive exclusion is when one species eliminates another. They gain access to the resource, they win contest competition, they exploit it without allowing the other species to essentially have any of it. Competitive exclusion, again, is predicted by 3 out of the 4 scenarios in our Lotka-Volterra equations for competition. But there are some very specific characteristics and assumptions that lead to competitive exclusion. And the first thing that has to be true for competitive exclusion to happen is that the 2 species that are interacting have to be complete competitors. They have to have the exact same resources and niche needs. Otherwise, you'll have niche differentiation and you'll find a little space where each of you can live. But if you use the same stuff, one species will win in almost all instances. It means that you have to have the same resource requirements. And the other thing that becomes very important in competitive exclusion is that the environment is constant. There cannot be any variation over space and time in the environment. That also tends to lead to competitive exclusion. And this is another case where we know out in the world that those things vary constantly, okay? And so there's going to be very few instances in the real world where competitive exclusion takes place. But in the lab, that's what we see all the time. When we bring 2 species into the lab and we grow them together, we often see competitive exclusion, that one is the best competitor because we're keeping resources and the environment constant. We're forcing them to live in the same niche space and be direct competitors. And that idealized world does lead to the extinction of one species, but that's not what actually happens in most instances. The work that led to kind of the formalization of the competitive exclusion hypothesis was done by a gentleman by the name of Gauss, and he formalized this as Gauss's exclusion principle, that if 2 species in the same environment with the exact same niches exist, they cannot coexist. Whoever is the best competitor for resources, either has the highest carrying capacity or can gain access to the resources fastest. In the case of our laboratory experiment with these two diatoms, will win and drive the other two extinction. All right. So that's competitive exclusion, that's extinction, that's one of the possible outcomes of competition. But as I've mentioned, those assumptions, those things that lead to competitive exclusion rarely happen in nature, in the real world. We know that environmental conditions vary over space as well as time. We spent a lot of time talking about this and why that occurs. And those variations affect the result of competition between different species. And thus we see that coexistence is a lot more common for these kind of basic reasons. Environmental factors vary on space and time. There can be multiple limiting resources. It's not just silica. It's not just access to prey items. It's not just access to nesting sites. There's a whole bunch of factors that bleed into what's happening with any given species at one time. And because of those variances, again, they create a little spot for each species to be the best and to carve out a space where they can exist. And that's resource partitioning. That's gaining access to a little bit in a particular set of conditions where you are the best competitor, where you do essentially drive out the other species, but they don't go extinct because you're not the best competitor everywhere. Okay, all right. So in niche differentiation, which is part of this idea of resource partitioning, we see that organisms find a space either over geographic differences or temporal differences where they do win competition. And as such, then they have a spot where they're the best competitor, but they're not the best competitor everywhere, and that allows other species to coexist. And so the basis of niche differentiation is that environmental variations occur, and that allows for coexistence. The environment's not stable, and so you can't have competitive exclusion. This is an example of changes in environmental conditions over space, over geographic change. We're looking at water temperature differences in a freshwater stream. That's the green line. And so we can see that it's relatively cool, perhaps at the higher elevations, the northern latitudes of the stream, and then either it gets shallower or runs into a tropical region, and all of a sudden the temperature shoots up. These three fish species live in this stream, and they have different abundances in different places. And they are kind of assessing this on the number of food items that are eaten by these different types of species. And so we see that the brook trout and the brown trout are in competition when the water temperature is cooler. That's their fundamental niche, like they can exist at cooler temperatures. But the creek chub is a warm water fish species. And so its numbers and its predation is much less in the cooler portions of the stream. And so it's not competing with these guys here. When the water temperature goes up, that's when the creek chub can live and be more competitive. It's a better competitor at higher temperatures because these other two trout species do really poorly in warm water conditions. They're cold water, freshwater fish species. That change in water temperature over space in this river creates a spot where trout are preferred and then chub are preferred. Okay? It allows for coexistence. They don't necessarily coexist in high concentrations with each other, but in the ecosystem as a whole, they're there. Okay, they're all three there. It's also pretty clear that the brown trout is a better competitor here. It's eating more stuff than the brook trout, the exception being in those really cold waters at the top. And again, that's this niche differentiation, the place where you have the best environmental tolerance is where you're going to do better. But because environmental conditions change, you're less tolerant. You have an abiotic barrier to you being in other environments. And that lets other species be there. That makes sense. Okay. This is another example of that, and that environmental conditions vary and thus allow for coexistence. And this is an example where environmental conditions vary over time. So that was changes in water temperature over the course of a stream. This is changes in water and moisture over different years. And we're looking at savanna grasses. I think this was done either in Africa or in our own kind of plains region here of the United States. And we see that the occurrence of these two types of grasses shifts. One is the competitor that's best early on, and then it kind of drops off and the blue guy comes up, okay, and suddenly becomes the best competitor. They're both there, but who is dominating the ecosystem changes. And we see that at the same time that our green guy here drops off, we see that rainfall really picks up in this particular ecosystem. And it looks like there's different fundamental needs for moisture in these two grass species. And when it was dry, this guy does better. But when it's wet, the blue grass does better. It can be a better competitor. And because rainfall varies temporally, both with rainy season as well as over the course of about a decade here, that shifts who's the best competitor in the ecosystem. Those changes seasonally or decadally then allow for coexistence of species. They allow for new species to come into a community and then they die back off. And that's another thing to recognize, both on an evolutionary timescale as well as on a community timescale, is that community composition in organisms are not static over time. Okay, it can change. Just like we have different biomes and different ecosystems and different places on Earth, we can have different communities at different times in the same location. And this is a great example of that. And again, it's because the environment changed. Okay, the amount of rainfall changed. Okay, all right. This allows for coexistence, and they can interact with each other, and that the best competitor can vary over both space and time. And it definitely happens all of the time. And we're starting to be able now to talk about community interactions and to place our populations of species that we've been talking about into a community context. And this data is looking at different plant species of thistles. They all have these kind of purple to white flowers that often have prickers and spines on the stems, but they're an excellent species for herbivory by small rodents and a variety of different types of insects. When we grow these guys alone, they can do just about the same kind of growth curve, okay? This guy in red definitely seems to have poor tolerance for low nutrient conditions. That's what goes on the x-axis, is relative nutrient concentration. But by and large, they do pretty well on their own under these types of conditions. They look very similar in growth rate. When we put them all together in the same thing, we see that the outcome of competition is different than their individual growth curves might suggest. You know, the ordering of the different color lines changes. And we do see that this red guy or gal that does poorly at low nutrient conditions does really poorly at low nutrient conditions when they have to compete. But then they can rise up in the population still at high nutrient concentrations when there's less competition for resources. And this means that depending upon the nutrient concentration, who is winning is going to flip-flop back and forth between all these different types of thistle species. It means they can carve out for themselves a geographic range where they do really well, or a season of the year in which they're the dominant flowering species, and then they die back and someone else comes up into the queue. Okay, do wait until you make a graph like this yourself. You can explain it to us. Look at my rainbow. This is my all right. One of my doctoral students that I worked with on my dissertation, she loved pink. And she was just like, I'm going to make all my text and my like graphs are going to be in pink. And it was like shocking to my dissertation advisor that she would choose pink as her like color choice. She was like, deal with it. Like, I like pink. It looks good on gray black background. He was like, sure. It's pink. And she's like, don't care. So rainbow can be good. All right. Again, another example of where the best competitor can vary over time as well as space. This is a classic example of salt marsh grasses that are growing in a salt marsh. And in reality, we see that Spartina alterniflora grows in the low marsh ecosystem, and Spartina patens dominates in the high marsh system. We see, though, that Spartina alterniflora can grow in the high marsh when it is grown by itself, but we don't ever see it growing there. And that's because it's competitively excluded by Spartina patens, okay, which is where Spartina patens does really well. The reason it can grow in the low marsh and not be outcompeted by Spartina patens everywhere is because Spartina patens can't live in the low marsh. It can't withstand the influx on a tidal basis of high salinity seawater. And so this means that, the fundamental niche of Spartina alterniflora is the whole thing. It can grow everywhere. But its realized niche is the low marsh, where it can gain access, but it doesn't have to be in direct competition with the other Spartina crabs. It's super interesting to go out into the salt marsh and see the gradient of plants that exist from the solid ground as you're getting into the more tidally inundated areas. You see these different species coexisting over this geographic range because their basic tolerances and competitive interactions limit them to bands in which they can occur. Sometimes they can occur in other places, but they don't because of competition or predation. Sometimes they don't occur in places because they can't, because their abiotic tolerances limit them to a particular range. Okay. Niche differentiation, something to keep in mind, and this data set is definitely messy, is that the more variables you introduce into the environment, you can then have niche differentiation on all those differing scales. So we've been looking at moisture and nutrients and temperature as like the defining factor of why we see certain species where we do. But all those things are happening and changing over gradients at the same time. And so the more differences and variables that you have in an ecosystem, it tends to really boost biodiversity. You tend to see that more and more species are parceling out a particular niche for themselves. And so in this data set, we're looking at phytoplankton diversity, and we're looking at a few different places and reefs, different ecosystems, Lewis, Jackson, and Yellowstone. And then we're looking at how their diversity changes over the course of this spring into the fall months. And the kind of purpley colors indicate lots of different phytoplankton species, and the blue colors indicate fewer phytoplankton species, less diversity. We're going to talk about, we've been introduced to Simpson's Biodiversity Index in some of our lab stuff. We're going to talk about it in terms of a community measurement of biodiversity in the coming weeks. And we see that biodiversity pops up and tends to increase at different times and in different locations. But what's true at each of these places where biodiversity gets high for these little phytoplankton is that that's a place where the number of different limiting resources tends to increase. That's the way. And that if there's lots of food, if the temperature is changing, if the salinity is changing, if the pH is changing, that all introduces a new little hypervolume where a phytoplankton species can be the best competitor. And so as things start to change, then that allows for more diversity. As temperature changes, as nutrient concentration changes, then you get for new species to appear over time and be introduced to the community. When things get stable, that's when diversity gets low. All right. In this case, there's all kinds of resource limitations like light and silicon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. Everything that your species needs becomes a limiting resource, but it also means then that you can specialize in that particular resource. Okay, all right. The last one here is resource partitioning, and it's definitely a subset of niche differentiation, the idea that you can share a particular resource in different ways. And one of them is by having lots of different resources, and by having that resource vary over time and space, then you can have a time and a space, a hypervolume where you're the best competitor. The other thing you can do is become very specialized in a subset of that resource. And that makes you the best competitor for that bit. And you can exclude other species then from your bit. but it means that your possible niche and habitat shrinks to whatever you're specialized in. Okay, so it's a benefit in that it reduces competition because you can be the best at something and exclude other species, but it comes at a price in that you can't live other places because you have become so specialized for this particular resource. Okay. Resource partitioning tends to happen in similar species that have a very similar habitat, and they then manage to portion out and share the resource by becoming specialized. They exist together at the same time and in the same place, but they share a resource by moving into a specialized niche space. So in our previous examples, organisms were sharing a resource by being a better competitor at a particular place or a particular time. And here they're sharing a place and time by specializing and portioning out the resource. And the classic example, again, is looking at these different warbler species. And the highlighted region is the portion of the conifer tree where they eat and make their nests. They all live in the same types of conifer trees, but they specialize in the portion of the tree that they utilize as their actual habitat. And as such, they don't have direct competition with each other, and they find a place and a way to coexist. This often results in microhabitats, these little pockets where one species lives, and the next little pocket over, it's a different species. And what we see is that we have numerous coexisting species in a particular region, much more than would be expected by chance. Okay, and so all of a sudden you see this diversification of warbler species living in conifer trees. And it's like, why is biodiversity of warblers so high? Well, it's a consequence evolutionarily of resource partitioning, of specialization. And again, competition then becomes a selective force on an evolutionary timescale, and that natural selection, competition, selects for you becoming a specialist and removing yourself from directly competing with other species. The outcome of that is coexistence and resource partitioning, niche differentiation, specialization. All right, here's some data again, looking at resource partitioning. In this case, we have 7 different competing anemone fish species, the little clownfish guys. They have to compete for anemones. There are 3 different anemone species living in this data set, which is, I think, off the coast of Indonesia. And there are 4 zones in terms of temperature as well as nearness and light to the shoreline. So there's like a near shore zone, a mid lagoon zone, along that outer barrier island, and then offshore sites. And what they find is that different anemone species live in different zones. And then different anemone fish have a particular zone in which they live, and then a particular anemone in which they specialize in being the best symbiont with. And as such, then, the different fish species are restricted to a particular place and location where they live, but they all get to live. And they competitively exclude each other from certain sites and certain anemones, but they don't drive them to extinction from the face of the planet. They partition out the resource. And so we see that in some of our different sites. These are the different types of anemones. We see that different fish species live in this anemone in the nearshore environments versus the offshore environment. And again, we see a similar trend. There's a fish species that specializes in this anemone in the nearshore, and a different one that does it in the offshore. And again, the same thing here. Our green fish species specializes in our 3rd type of anemone in this environment, and these guys tend to share it in the nearshore environment. By being the best competitor for a particular resource, you get to live and win, but it restricts where you are found. Okay, it restricts your access to the resource. Okay. All right. Does that make sense? All of this data and these questions are often generated in the quest for an answer to why do we find this species here and not over there? Okay, like, why is this the habitat of this particular species? And you may find that it's this interaction between competition and predation, as well as the environmental tolerances of the species. It happens over and over again. Okay, I have just kind of two more examples of resource partitioning here. This is in plants, and again, I'm trying to give you like the animal and plant example so that you can broaden your horizons both to be excited about plants and also to recognize like the same things apply. Okay, so 3 competing prairie grasses. They compete for soil, nutrients, as well as moisture. Those are the dominating limiting resources for these species. And we see that they have evolved different root structures that allow them to get into different soil horizons so that they're not in direct competition with one another for those limiting resources. And as such, they can coexist. They can grow right next to each other because even though they're using the same resources, they're getting them from different places. And thus they have partitioned out the subsoil area so they can live together. Again, none of them do great, but at least they get to be there. Okay. The last example here of resource partitioning is in these competing feline species. And so these are small cats that exist. I have to look if it's in, I think it's in Africa based upon what I know about this guy, but it could be in South America as well. They have a variety of small cat species in both the pampas and the high mountains in South America as well. We see that their prey is a limiting resource. They all are trying to eat very similar small mammals and bird species, and in some cases insects. And we see that they have developed and evolved different tooth sizes, even between males and females in the same species, okay? But definitely between the 3 species, we see a change in tooth size. And this tooth size is related to the size of their prey items. So smaller teeth means they take smaller prey items, bigger teeth means they can take bulkier, heavier prey items. And so they're taking the whole possible prey space and they're divvying it up, just like birds with different bill sizes and thicknesses do. And again, those organisms that have a specialization can be really good at catching small prey. And thus they'll win competition in this niche space. They'll do poorly down here, but they don't need to because they can do really well here. Okay? And by doing poorly over here, that allows this other species to take over those prey items and specialize and do really well. And again, the idea that these guys probably share a common ancestor that had one set of teeth, but as mutations arose, they were able to specialize in certain prey items and thus produce more offspring, and thus their populations diverged and changed over time. And what was one cat species became 3, each with their own specialization in what they eat. That's defined by and related to and enhanced and selected for by their tooth size. Oh, really cool. The next time you go to the cat valley at the zoo, you can be like, that's cool, there are different size cats. And they all eat different things. And like, we just see this and we're like, that's awesome. But like, it's an evolutionary consequence of competition. It's an evolutionary consequence of changing environments over spacing. And what's phenomenal about it is that we don't see competitive exclusion a lot. Mostly for 2 reasons. One is that we don't see the species that went extinct. Okay, like they're dead and gone. They're not here for us to be observed. We can see them sometimes in the fossil record. And 2, because coexistence is really favored by natural selection. And that there's other factors involved than just competition. And that allows for coexistence. All right. So if I give you like a list and I say, what are the 3 possible outcomes of 2 species competing together? You're going to be like extinction, niche differentiation, resource partition. And then you can give me an example. Bacteria in the lab, one kills the other one. That's extinction. Niche differentiation. What would you say for niche differentiation as an example?
The fish that lives in like 4 different zones.
Yeah, good. It's fish that live in different places. What would you give me as an example of resource partition?
the wobblers that are eating those.
Yeah, the ones that live in the different parts of the tree. And again, resource partitioning is definitely a subset of niche differentiation, and so the examples really overlap and they show very similar things. Cool.
So if you ask a question about resource partitioning and like niche differentiation for examples, we could just use that for both.
You'd have to give me two different ones,
Gotcha.
but I would let you put them in. I would say that the resource partitioning examples could be examples of niche differentiation. It doesn't always work the opposite way, but it can.
Gotcha.
But y'all give me two different things. Okay, cool. All right. I have just a couple questions for you guys. Okay, so we have our Galapagos finches, and we see that the frequency and proportion in the population of smaller bills and bigger bills changes over time, and that these guys will eat different size seeds, and that the different sizes of seeds varies over time as well. So how does the changing seed size affect competition between these species?
There's less competition.
Yeah, it means that there's less competition. What else?
They coexist because they're eating like different. They're specialized in eating different.
Definitely. Okay, because there is differentiation in bill size and differentiation in diet, they can coexist. Thinking as your species is winning competition, what does it mean if the size of the seeds varies over time?
One's going to outcompete the other at different points.
Right, exactly. Who's the best competitor is going to change at any given point, depending upon what seeds are available. And it leads to speciation. It leads to species becoming, one species becoming two. Okay. And that because traits are varying and because traits have a selective advantage at different times, the population can evolve from one species into two. Okay. These types of temporal variations have a lot of impact on species and competition. Okay. All right. One thing that I hope you recognize is that in the laboratory, we can run experiments with competition. We can come up with nice conclusions. So, oh, this species doesn't live here because it can't, it can't withstand the drier moisture or the hotter temperatures. When we go out into the world, this gets messy fast. And there are lots of variables that affect species, and there are lots of interactions that can be difficult for us to quantify. And then again, we may be measuring for lots of things, and then you don't measure for the thing that actually matters for that species' tolerances, or you aren't aware that there's an endosymbiotic bacteria in their gut that actually makes them able to eat what it is that they eat. And so our idealized laboratory experiments and our kind of idealized vision of the world around us is naive lots of times. And it makes understanding and interpreting our data in the world around us complex, but also very interesting and very exciting, I think. Definitely species competition can be positive or negative for a given species. If you're winning, if you have specialized, then you're going to increase in population abundance. But if you are being outcompeted, you're going to decline. And that happens at an individual as well as a species basis. What we tend to see is that interspecies competition increases biodiversity, that organisms specialize, and in doing so, they speciate and they diverge. You get that disruptive selection that moves a species towards either end of their phenotype extremes. Their resource partitioning drives them into becoming a new species that is no longer interacting with and has gene flow with other members of the same thing. And again, those warblers and those conifer trees, that was one species that's now 7 because of resource partitioning. Yeah.
You said like interspecies is always negative for both of them?
It is in general, like over kind of the long-term space, it depresses their overall population numbers for both species. Given resource partitioning and specialization, you can have different pockets where one species does well and the other species does poorly. But in general, their carrying capacity is lower for both of them. It's just like, it gets messy fast. And that's good because it lets lots of species coexist. And again, if everything was static and stable, there would be a best competitor. There would be one type of grass and one type of tree. And that's what we would have. And there's value in that, but there's also lots of value in biodiversity. Definitely competition is a force for natural selection. And that if you are a direct competitor with another species, it will favor differentiation. It will favor specialization. It will favor the development of new species. So we have our two Galapagos finch species. These are two different species. They exist in different frequencies on different islands, which are the names here. There's one island where they occur together. And we see that when they occur together, they have very different sizes in their beak depth. But when they occur alone, they move towards that middle range, okay, where they can access a variety of different types of seeds. But when they live together, they're in direct competition, and so then they specialize, and their phenotype reflects that. This is a classic story of food specialization driving competition and acting as a natural selective force. But what else, other than food competition, might account for these differences in bill sizes that we see on Santa Cruz from when they exist kind of by themselves? What else might be a selective factor for these finches?
Water availability.
Sure, access to water. What else?
Type and size of seeds might
That
vary from island to island based on
Good, yeah.
location.
What about something that would happen within your species?
Social display.
Yeah, exactly. Mate choice, okay? At the same time that there's a selective force for your basic biological needs, you also have these other competing forces that can play a role in the actual traits that we see in organisms. And that's important to remember too. It makes this a very complex picture, and that again, our understanding is often very simplified version of what's actually happening for any given species. There are lots of different selective forces acting on organisms at the same time. Okay, all right. Just some examples of these different specializations that we see in different types of organisms. These are all different types of fish. Our deep sea anglerfish there. They are uniquely specialized for partitioning out the ocean environment in their habitat choices, in their fin morphology, in their body size, in their mouth morphology and orientation. Our little anemone fish are really adapted for quick, agile movements in the coral reef with their small, little, flexible fins. They have forward-facing eyes and mouths because that's where their food is coming from. It's going to be right on the level of where they are. That's really different than a striped marlin, which is this big guy that lives in the open ocean. The striped marlin has to go out and catch its food. It has a really aerodynamic shape. It has a ton of muscle mass. Its fins are very stiff to allow it to get the most efficient swimming motion and power out of every flick of its tail. It has, again, really forward-facing eyes and mouth because that's where its food is going to be. Its coloration is very different than the clownfish or the other two. It needs to blend in with the blue of the ocean environment. The halibut and the deep sea anglerfish are even more specialized when it comes to fins and mouths and body shapes. You know, the halibut spends its whole life as a lion weight predator on the seafloor. Okay, and it eats mollusks and fish that swim over the top of it when it reaches out and grabs them. When it is a juvenile reaching sexual maturity, it goes from being a free swimming fish to one of these bottom dwellers, and one of its eyes migrates from one side of its head to the other, so that it has two eyes on one side of its head, so it can see its food that's above it. Okay, like totally cool.
I didn't know that their eyes like migrated as they got older.
Yeah, and like most halibut are like left-eyed, like their two eyes are on like the left side of their body.
Do they grow on the right side of their body too? Is that
They
right?
can, but those two
More
eyes on the
rare.
right side are much rarer than the like left eye. Don't know why. It's the same thing like narwhals, and one of their front teeth has grown out as their tusk, these tusked whales, and almost all of them are right-toothed. It's the right front tooth that grows out. And left is much rarer. It's not like a can, just a little.
Yeah.
The anglerfish, of course, this is a black-bodied organism for living in the ocean depths. It has little fins for not doing a whole lot. Its mouth is very upward facing. Its eyes are much reduced because it's not a light predator. It does have bioluminescence in order to attract prey. And then, what is this?
That is the dead mate.
It's a mate, yeah. So most large anglerfish are females, and the males
It's still alive,
become,
actually?
it is, yeah. It's a parasite on the
Absorbing.
female. Yeah, it's
Crazy.
really hard to find a mate in the deep ocean. Like you just gotta run into each other. So when you find one, you stick together. And he'll become, he has like a suckery mouth, and he becomes part of her circulatory system, and she feeds him. And then she provides sperm whenever she's ready to mate. They're together for life.
Still better love story.
I know. I'm like, if you think your boyfriend is bad, at least you're not a deep sea anglerfish.
He like becomes part of her, like it just like grows and
Yeah, eventually he'll get kind of like lumpy, like he loses his, morphology. I don't ever think he like fully tumorizes on her, but her tissue does start to like grow over him to some extent.
Special.
Special, he said. I don't need that from my boss.
sweet.
All right.
Valentine's Day cards or something.
Valentine's.
We see this specialization in birds too. All kinds of different wing and beak and foot morphologies adapted for specializing in different prey items, different nutritional resources. Some of it in terms of bright coloration is definitely mate choice, sexual selection driven, but a lot of it has to do with resource specialization. Again, the hummingbird's really agile, wings and long bills for drinking nectar, little feet for perching on stems. Really super different than the big heavy beak and talons of the bald eagle for catching and tearing prey items, big wings for soaring as they search for prey, want to use very little energy in doing so. The flamingo, this is a plankton filter feeder, and so their bill is adapted for them to be able to sieve out plankton from their water environments, paddle-like feet again so that they don't sink into the mud and can walk in shallow waters in order to feed. Their wings are like okay. Like they do both soaring and gliding as well as long distance migration. So they have kind of a middling morphology. And the toucan, this is a fruit nut eater, and so he has this big, thick bill, these little perching feet, because that's what he eats instead of, catching prey with his feet. This beautiful plumage and camouflage to blend in with the rainforest environment as one of the attractions. Okay, we see it in mammals too. And that mammals specialize in these same types of things in order to partition out the available food resources around them. Bats are crazy specialized, right? Like they have become specialized for flight in terms of what their forelimbs can do. They have these big giant ears and the ability to echolocate in order to find insect as well as fruit food around them. Wolves are, similar to bats, like they share a common ancestor, but they're radically different. Okay, the wolf is really adapted for running. Has teeth and claws for catching food items and tearing it apart. Totally different social structure in order to allow for growth and reproduction than what happens in a backbone. And then the anteater, of course, is a specialized insectivore, really long fur in order to deter predators, very broad feet to act kind of like snowshoes in the sand desert environment, where they tend to find their food items. And then, of course, this really adapted snout and tongue to suck out termites and ants from termite and ant mounds. And their claws are adapted to dig into the mounds so they can get in there to eat their insect food. And did you know that baby anteaters ride on their wall?
Oh.
Just like a thing. It's totally different between these different ones. Competition for resources causes specialization. It is a natural selective force that creates the diversity of species and organisms that we see around us. Intense competition leads to speciation just as often as it leads to extinction. And even when intense competition causes a species to go extinct, that becomes niche space that opens up for a species then to evolve into. I really like how we teach evolution and ecology together because they interact with each other so intimately in terms of outcomes for the organisms in the world that we see around us. Okay, all right. Okay, I'm going to talk about invasive species. Can anybody give me an example of a species that you know is invasive?
Honeysuckle.
Honeysuckle, yeah, our classic one in our ecosystem.
Python?
Yeah, pythons in the Everglades.
Love bugs.
Yeah, love bugs,
Those
and
June
again, they're normal in some parts of the U.S. and they're problematic in others.
Yeah, no, or I should say Florida. They're kind of like
Things
predators.
that-
What are those barnacles in the Great Lakes?
The zebra mussels.
Yeah, zebra mussels, yeah, those ones are pretty.
Definitely an invasive species. Why are they invasive species?
They have no predators.
They have no predators. They
They're just doing really good.
do really good.
Yeah, out-competing.
They're out competing the normal native wildlife in that particular region. That's like what we call an invasive species. Is one that we have this new species that comes into an ecosystem, and because it doesn't have predators, diseases aren't here, it becomes the best competitor, and it forces competitive exclusion of the native organisms there. Okay, it's experiencing exponential population growth because its limiting resources aren't limiting to it anymore. And as such, it's this neat little pocket of understanding competition to look at invasive species and invasive species biology. Invasive species are a type of introduced species. Introduced species are ones that are occurring in an ecosystem in which they did not originally evolve. So they're not native to that particular ecosystem. You can be not native and just be there, like honeybees in the United States, European honeybees. Or you can be harmful and non-native. And when you have a detrimental effect on the ecosystem around you, you become an invasive species. You're not just introduced or non-native, you now have become a problem. And that's what we consider the invasive. 98% of our food supply comes from introduced species, the European honeybee, in terms of pollination. Lots of times non-native species can do significant pest control resources for us, and that these are introduced spiders or insect species that eat other things. They eat nematode worms, or they eat disease-causing bacteria in the environment around us. And so they can be helpful. Introduced species don't have to be harmful, but we don't talk about them a whole lot. And we tend to talk about the ones that are detrimental to the ecosystems where they appear. In fact, about 40% of documented species extinctions since 1750 can be in part caused by interactions and competition with an invasive species. So when we consider threats to biodiversity today, invasive species is near the top of the list. It's something that causes pressure on native organisms. It reduces their population sizes, puts them in danger of extinction from habitat loss, from climate change, from pollution interactions. It's a real contributing factor. In fact, it's a cause, one of the causes in the listing of 42% of the US's endangered species. And it's a huge problem in places like Hawaii, where we have very endemic, specialized native fauna and flora. And in fact, invasive species are a cause of endangerment for 95% of Hawaii's listed endangered species. Like, it's a huge problem. And again, it just takes a couple new species in an environment to unbalance the whole thing and to cause real problems. Why are they becoming invasive? They outcompete native organisms for resources. They lack their native predators and diseases, and so there's no control on their population size. And they eat the native organisms that are there. And so they take away food, they take away habitat space, they take away nesting space, they overgrow other plant species. They consume the niche space, and then they drive out the native organisms. This is Asian big-headed carp that are being caught along the Illinois River in 2004, and invasive carp are a real problem in the Mississippi River Basin. They were probably accidentally introduced either from the pet trade, like ornamental ponds that people had in their backyards, or in aquaculture operations where we were farming them to grow fish to eat, and they got out into the native freshwater ecosystem. And they have been moving their way up the Mississippi River Valley for the last 15 years or so. They are just now starting to appear in the Ohio River, and I think they're like just on the verge of hitting the Great Lakes. And that's really problematic because they eat a ton of stuff, and there's nothing that eats them other than us. And so their population just booms, and they eat all the prey of fish species, and then there's none of the little fish. and then there's no food for the big fish, and then the normal native big fish die, and you're left with carp, who happily eat each other. So we have these big programs to fish for carp, to try to make an industry in eating carp, like that of frying catfish, in order to cause people to try to get these fish out of these ecosystems. But it's an increasing problem, as it's a huge competitor for resources and resource space here in the United States. The environmental impact of these invasive species, when they have these population explosions, because they don't have any limitations on their population growth, they push out everybody else. And the overall consequence is that we lose biodiversity. And we lose it at a bunch of different levels. We lose genetic diversity, we lose species diversity, the ecosystem changes, and as a result, we get biosphere change as these things kind of globetrot into new ecosystems. And again, we often see that organisms are moving in these cases from one continent to another in very similar biomes. And so their fundamental tolerances for moisture and temperature have caused them to evolve in one place. But they can live very happily in the same moisture and temperature regime somewhere else. And then when they're introduced into those places, they go crazy because there's not any predators or diseases limiting them. They displace native species, they disrupt food webs, they can really shift the energy flow within ecosystems, and they can cause community succession. They can take what was a forest and turn it into a prairie. They can take a freshwater flowing stream and turn it into a pond. And again, they do things that tend to benefit themselves, of course, but then that's detrimental to the native biology. And again, the invasive species might have some benefits to them, like we can eat invasive Asian carp, not a bad fish, but it's just really different than what was in that ecosystem before. And that's concerning. And again, in terms of a conservation perspective, invasive species really ask us, what do we want our ecosystem to look like? Do we want it to look like this, where it's one species dominated by this invasive, or is there some value in having a diversity of species and a diversity of genetics within the species? This top picture here is invasive zebra mussel, again in the Great Lakes ecosystem. There's this mollusk, and it just overgrows everything. It really outcompetes native mollusk species, clams and oysters, and mussels for habitat space. It's not really eaten by our fish species here. They can't get into its harder shell than our native mollusk species. And so it just goes crazy. Really costs a lot of communities along the Great Lakes a lot of money in order to clean it out of their sewer and drainage pipes each year. Because it just grows until it clogs stuff up. They're not, I wouldn't say that I haven't tried to eat one myself. But I would say they're inedible. No one's just
Yes.
like looking at it.
Yeah, I've never heard anybody
No.
be like, yes, I eat zebra
Zebra
mussels.
mussels.
Yeah.
They don't grow to those big, beautiful sizes like you would get a mussel.
Yeah.
They're
They
much
just stack.
smaller. Yeah.
They're still like,
In the bottom, we have trailing blackberry, which is the invasive species in the Pacific Northwest. That is similar to the problems we have with honeysuckle here in Ohio. It just overgrows everything. And in doing so, it shades out the other plant species that are supposed to be in that ecosystem. It wins competition for light and moisture, and then it just radically changes what's happening in that ecosystem. In terms of blackberry, birds still eat the blackberries. It's not like they're toxic or anything. Still can be a habitat. It's just different than what was there before. And same thing with honeysuckle. Like there are species that utilize the honeysuckle. They're just different from the mix and the proportion of the native wildlife. It's very different. Okay, I think rather than expounding upon the problems with invasive species, I want to give you some examples. One thing that I do want to mention is that invasive species, they're environmentally problematic, and then they're really economically problematic, and that it costs us a lot of money to clean them up when they overgrow stuff or clog pipes. They interfere with our normal harvesting processes of organisms that we were normally harvesting from those ecosystems. And when you get honeysuckle or blackberry overgrowing something, nobody wants to go on a hike in that region or go camping there. It really can affect ecotourism. And again, this is the case with the lionfish eating all the beautiful coral reef fish in the Caribbean. Like, this is a problem. Okay, lionfish are cool, but like, you go snorkeling to see lots of kinds of fish, not just lionfish.
And then the fish that could
And
hurt
especially
you.
when you like can't touch the lionfish, and you shouldn't touch the fish anyway. So like, you're gonna swim the other direction from the lionfish if you actually see one.
Yeah, when I went,
They're quite
when I went scuba diving, they did like, for snorkeling, they drew like the bread and then all
Yeah,
the little fish would come and take like a picture.
Yeah.
But like, they did say like, they're giving us like invasive species, like warnings and stuff. They like to watch out for obviously like stingrays that like to come up when there's the bread and
Yeah.
stuff. And they see all these like little crayfish and same things like lionfish and stuff.
Yes, exactly. It's an impact. It's no fun when you go to see the classic organism of that environment and you can't find it because it's been driven out by an invasive species. Okay, all right. So in our region, we're familiar with the emerald ash tree borer, which is this beautiful little beetle at the top. Like the adults are actually kind of pretty, but their larvae eat the living tissue right underneath the bark of ash trees, and so they've caused major change in our Ohio forest in the last 5 years as they've killed off all of our native ash trees. And that really changes the mix of tree species in our forest. And as Phil was telling us as he was holding the cute little armadillo, like that changes what plants can actually germinate and grow in our forest because it's supposed to be this mix between different plant species that has radically altered. In the Pacific coast, they have an invasive beetle species as well, the mountain pine beetle. That does the same thing. It eats the living tissue right under the bark of all their conifer evergreen trees. And so this is a picture of one of the forests in Canada and British Columbia. And all the brown trees are dying evergreen trees due to an infestation of mountain pine beetle. It has radically changed the timber harvest and industry in British Columbia, Washington State, Montana, as they try to deal with this. The wood that comes out of these types of trees, both the ash tree as well as these conifers, it's degraded. It's not good for the same types of purposes that it would be if it was not impacted by this. Like you can't make countertops and cabinets out of it. It's got beetle traps. And you got to make wood pulp or plywood out of it. It really changes the value of the forest. Nematode worms are a real problem in our agriculture ecosystems. Nematode worms are, again, these little soil invertebrates, and they can cause the roots of plants to form these kind of tumors. And as such, then they're not as good at taking up nutrients and moisture, and the plants tend to grow less as the worms feed off the plants and then cause them to change their root morphology. And so it leads to lots of crop loss when you have a nematode worm infestation. And they actually cause 5% of all global crop losses are to nematode rootworm infections. And as these worms get transplanted and moved from similar ecosystems as crops and seeds are moved around, then they become problematic in new ecosystems. We have to spray more pesticides in order to get rid of them, which has some downstream environmental effects as well. All right. I'm going to give you a few plant examples of invasive species. This is the story of kudzu. Where I grew up in Arkansas and Alabama, kudzu was the honeysuckle or the trailing blackberry. It's the invasive species that is very obvious throughout the ecosystem. Kudzu is a fast-growing vine that was intentionally brought from Japan. It overgrows everything. Okay, like this is like a telephone pole. Okay. It likes kelp. It can grow like a foot a day under the right conditions. And there's lots of rainfall and just the right temperatures. It was brought here in order to be a winter crop to hold the soil in place between summertime harvest. And then we also hoped that it would be a great cattle food. So like you could put out a herd of cattle, they would eat the kudzu would grow back quickly, the cattle could stay there, you could get more head of cattle off less ground. Cows don't like to eat kudzu. Any cows in Japan. Yeah, you should have done that first. I don't have any the story of kudzu was like, where was our common sense? Just collectively missing.
What's really nice in the vine though, it's like everywhere.
Yeah, and it's problematic there too. Okay, and again, it overgrows the native wildlife, and it causes this huge problem. It grows over houses. It grows over. We don't really have telephone lines anymore. It grows up cell phone tower, disrupts their ability, causes them to topple over.
Fences.
Say again.
Fences.
Fences. Oh yeah. You leave your car sitting in your yard for a season, and it's covered in kudzu when you go back. It's very resistant to common herbicides, so it's hard to kill. I mean, you can burn it off, but like, you're not gonna set fire to like a neighborhood to get rid of kudzu. We thought that we could bring over the kudzu bug, which is what is the main predator of kudzu in Japan,
We just have a bunch of kudzu bugs there now.
but it eats soybeans, which is a major crop in the southern United States where this thing is a problem. Another great idea where you're like, should have thought of that first before you just dump this out there in the environment.
Test.
Oh, and herbicides are infected?
Yeah.
Oh, that's lovely.
It's a real bummer of a invasive species.
The first question is why not test with cows?
Our new ideas for trying to control kudzu again is to try to get it to be economically valuable so that we'll go out and clean it up ourselves. And the idea that we can turn it perhaps into wood pulp for the paper industry, or we can use it as a biofuel. And then again, like it'd be this biomass that you could collect and burn in order to, generate steam to make electricity. Good ideas on how to handle this and maybe get a handle on the kudzu infestation, but it's really problematic. And it was brought into the southern United States, and then now it's leapfrogged over into some new ecosystems where it can be equally problematic. It'll never get much beyond this because it's not very cold tolerant. So there's some limitations to how far it will spread. Purple loosestrife is a problem here in Ohio. This was brought over intentionally in the 1800s from Europe as an ornamental herb to grow in people's gardens. It has these beautiful bright purple flowers that bloom. But it competes and outcrowds our native wetland plants. And in doing so, it changes the water flow of the ecosystem. And particularly, it's one of the main invasive competitors for cattails, which are this very important wetland organism here in the Midwestern United States, both as a food resource, nesting habitat, and soil erosion preventer. It's very chemical resistant, just like kudzu, and you have to pull it out, roots and all, kind of like honeysuckle again, in order to get rid of it. Very time intensive, and you gotta wear like waders to get out into the wetland to actually get at this thing. And you can make pretty bouquets of flowers out.
I have like any type
again,
of tea, any type of like herbal, like, you know what I mean? That anybody do?
Not that I
anything with
know of. And again, because
Anything
it's
natural.
not,
I'm not saying I would, I'm just saying.
because we as the Americans haven't grown up with it as part of our ecosystem, then we have no like historical knowledge of how to use this plant that would have any kind of value. It makes 2.7 million seeds per plant. So it spreads super well. And it can become really problematic. Cheatgrass is a similar problem. Again, it was brought over to be cattle food, or actually as an accidental hitchhiker, sorry, from Europe in the 1800s. It's now one of our dominant prairie plants. It is highly flammable. Totally helps in wildfire situations to have cheatgrass growing rather than the normal grasses that are fire tolerant and will regenerate easily after fire. It's very problematic. Again, it's a main cause of kind of changing in this sagebrush landscape from that kind of desert chaparral ecosystem into true prairie ecosystem. Giant hogweed is becoming an increasing problem. This is a wild carrot that was brought over again to be an ornamental garden plant, but it causes severe third-degree burns if you get the sap on it, on human skin. And so you go out to cut out this plant from your field or your garden, and you can end up in the ER. Very problematic. It's very resistant again to herbicides. Looking at introducing again a bug that would normally eat it, or a disease that occurs in its normal environment. But we're very tentative about that because we have had this experience with kudzu. We recognize that we have to be very careful about any type of pest management system that we would introduce. You see increasingly kind of media warnings about giant hogweed now because it does have such a severe reaction for farmers and even kind of like city maintenance workers as they're trying to weed out or prepare plants that you would encounter. So like you're going to know when you're approaching one of these that maybe you shouldn't get too close. But again, that it has to be removed to be eradicated, and that makes this really difficult when it causes these toxins.
Why would they bring it over if you already get burns?
I don't know, man.
That's so stupid.
My garbage.
It reacts with sunlight.
Yes. So you get the sap on you, and then when your skin with the sap on is exposed to light, that's when it gets photoactivated to actually burn you. So you can be exposed to it and then not have a problem with it till like later. And so like you can get covered in it before like you realize that this is.
So if you
so-
catch it early enough, like you know,
You
like,
can wash it
okay,
off.
we
Yeah.
just
Alright,
went, like in depth
Yeah.
did this like all day.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Probably
exactly.
smart to do it almost at night.
Yeah, maybe. And then like long clothes and pants and like a
Yeah.
hood on.
And then.
Ski mask.
I bet I understand now why I got over here.
Yes.
So far.
Burn clothes.
I'm betting I understand now why they got it. They probably, if it didn't react right away, they probably just blamed it on something
Yeah, exactly.
magic.
Yeah, they could have blamed it on poison ivy.
I got a witch cursed me.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Here are your flowers, honey.
Gypsy moth is an invasive bug species, again, that our textbook really highlights. Again, we brought it over because we thought we could start a silk industry here in the mid-1800s, but it eats a ton of different types of plant species. Has really just expanded in its range since it first was brought into Massachusetts. We spend a lot of money spraying insecticide to get rid of this in our Northwest forests. Very problematic in that we've had reforestation in the Northwest corridor for the last 100 years. And this is like turning the tide from that. Like it just causes such a massive forest loss that we're seeing big impacts on ecosystems. Yeah, zebra mussels we talked about. Oh, it says you can eat them. Like I said, I haven't eaten them.
They do look small though, so it's not really worth the.
You just need to do a big old a boil or something of them.
Yeah,
Exactly.
maybe, yeah. Turn them into like clam chowder.
A giant citywide zebra boil, for zebra mussel boil.
The last two I want to highlight are wild boar and the Burmese python, two invasive larger species, a mammal and a reptile here. Wild boar were brought to the U.S. for sport hunting purposes. Like it's supposed to be super fun to like hunt down one of these guys and kill it.
I feel like it
I-
might get you.
The thrill of hunting a wild boar is not something that tops my list.
That is a very angry pig.
Aggressive.
They're very aggressive.
It's a
They'll-
very
when you corner them,
angry
they'll
piggy.
turn and they'll fight back, and so there's a bit of a danger that like you might get injured in hunting them, and so like I'm gonna pay extra money for that. I don't know. Of course, they're very destructive to their environment around them. They'll eat almost anything, and they'll dig up the soil in order to get at stuff. So they'll change the soil, which means that we change the plants that can grow there by disrupting the soil ecosystem. Of course, they got out from those sport hunting facilities and places where they had been fenced in, and they just have bred rapidly. Like nothing in our ecosystem eats them other than us, and there are not many of us eating them. They can have 10 to 12 piglets and a litter. And it costs us right now $1.5 billion a year to try to hunt them down and eradicate them from ecosystems where they're problematic, which includes the Ohio River Valley. They're more of a problem, again, in the Northeast where they were first introduced, and in places, again, like Arkansas, where the sport hunting for these types of organisms was a large industry. Our current idea to control the wild boar is to inject them with birth control, the females, so that they'll stop breeding. And then that'll help to control their population numbers. But right now, we don't have anything like we do for humans that's a long-term birth control. So you have to dart every female every year in order to make sure that she doesn't have a full reproductive cycle that year. And then Burmese pythons are an invasive reptile in the Everglades. They were very clearly released pets that then have taken over this ecosystem, and that people didn't want to take care of these big snakes. They put them back in their native environment, and they became problematic. Again, they eat everything. They can have lots of babies at a time. Nothing eats them. They can take down the American alligator. They eat all kinds of bird species, fish species, but totally change that ecosystem. It's really problematic when you have unhindered competition. This is competitive exclusion. This is having the best competitor for the resource, changing the full ecosystem.
Did it eat other people's pets? I know that there
Oh,
was an
yeah.
actual, I used to live down in Florida. I know that there was an actual like town, somewhere down, they had a problem with them like sitting in the trees, like there would be just like a ton of them just sitting in the trees, like eyeballing their pets while they're like walking their dog or something. Like, they wouldn't be that big,
Yeah,
but they'd be like
yeah.
4 or 5 feet long, or like 3 feet long, it's like, oh, they're things.
Yeah,
Still
there's
very
bounties for
intimidating.
Burmese python now, so some people have made it both like a sport hunting as well as like an actual business to go out and be part of this eradication effort.
I know they pay people to kill it.
Yes, exactly, like you can get money for doing it. It's not terribly dangerous, like they're not very venomous, like they're a constrictor, but like it's hard work and they struggle and then you gotta like kill them.
With constrictors, they have a lot of muscles.
Florida has like a lot of invasive because of like the exotic.
Oh, yeah, they have a lot of problems, yeah, they have a lot of different
Like
invasives.
they did it back in the good old days.
That really nice, hot, humid, hospitable
They
environment.
did, they were like, yeah, I got this.
Cowboys.
Okay.
Pack on boots and belt.
All right, if we don't want invasive species, don't let your pets go in the Everglades, okay? There's lots of ways that we can help with this.
Or iguanas starting to turn into that too. I think like they're getting pretty bad in it.
Thanks for the cookies.
I think
You're
it's
welcome. Do you like 'em?
they're almost like, they walk up and like eat food out of your hand.
You know, I don't know, and it's hard,
Hey,
I
good.
don't think I
Alright.
know
I'm saying
enough
it
to be
from
able
the-
to say.
All right.